All right, thank you very much, all of you, for coming. I'd like to welcome everybody to the Jordan Center today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Joshua Tucker. I'm the director of the Jordan Center and also a member of PONARS. And it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you here today. For those of you not familiar with the Jordan Center is NYU's Center for the Advanced Study of Russia. And our mission is essentially to encourage the study of Russia in all its forms and formats. So it's a great, great pleasure to be welcoming all of you here today for this conference. Just to alert everyone from the get-go, one of the things that we've been very active in doing is, one of our goals is to try to take Russia expertise and get knowledge, good scholarly-based knowledge about Russia out there, give it an airing so that people can access it, people can find it if they want to. We feel this is a very important role we as scholars can be playing today. And so along those lines, what we've been doing is we are live streaming all of our events. We're video archiving all of our events. We'll have blog posts after our events that sort of ease the access to get people into it so they can find high quality information about Russia and things related to Russia. But so I want to let everybody know here, all our panelists, all our participants, that the event is being recorded. It's being live streamed right now. And actually, one new initiative we have in the Jordan Center this year is we've been reaching out to smaller, primarily liberal arts colleges, but any program that's interested, any university or college that doesn't have its ability to have a lot of Russia programming itself. And we've been setting up arrangements whereby they sign up to kind of participate in the events via the live streaming. And we take questions from them online while we're live streaming. And so we have other people, other colleges who are joining us today through the live streaming. If you're interested in this, please approach me during one of the breaks for getting it set up. Obviously, there's some limits due to time zones, why this may not work out particularly well if we go too far east and most of our events are in the afternoon. But anyway, just want to make everyone aware of that and tell you a little bit about what we're doing. Also, the Jordan Center has a wonderful blog, which I do not write for, other people write for, but we have a wonderful blog. If you sign up for our email list before the end of the day today, you'll get announcements when there are blog posts up, as well as summaries and recaps of events that you can find as well, and you can see the speakers. As I said, we archive all this. So I'd like to begin by thanking a number of people without whom this wouldn't be possible. So I'd like to first of all thank the members of the PONARS team, so Henry and Marlene, and Henry is here now, Henry in the back, and Marlene, where's Marlene? And Marlene's over here on the other side of the post for setting this up. I'd like to thank Will, the newest member of the PONARS team, who's in the back here. This has been a joint collaboration of PONARS and the Jordan Center. I would like to give a huge thanks to Heather Jansen Messina, who is here right in the corner here, who many of you have dealt with in getting arranged here, without which not only would this conference not be possible, nothing that happens at the Jordan Center would be possible. So a huge thanks for Heather. We'd like to thank the Carnegie Foundation for renewing its funding of PONARS, which has made all of this possible and makes many other things possible. And I'd also like to thank all of our presenters today for coming to New York to take part in this event. I know I have been waiting with bated breath to see what all of you have to say, and so for me this is a tremendous treat to be surrounded by so much expertise and to sort of focus on this topic, which I don't know if you get, but I get asked this question a lot of times. So it seems to be one of the great luxuries of my career that I'm able to take questions that I want answers to and have experts from all over the world come to help me answer those questions. So thank you all to being here today. As a bit of an introduction to what we're going to be talking about, today's actually kind of a momentous day in the United States. We managed to schedule our 1 year after the US election conference, 1 year after the US election. So a year ago, as you know, we had an event in the United States that surprised a few people. And this event had the potential, at the time, to drastically reshape US-Russian relations. In fact, the winning candidate, Donald Trump, had campaigned openly advocating for better US-Russian relations. And yet, 1 year in, I mean, you may correct me if I'm wrong, and I may have probably missed some holiday or some naming of, National Stamp Collector Month, but it seems to me that the only bipartisan activity that the US Congress has agreed upon since Donald Trump became president was to strengthen the sanctions against Russia and actually make it much harder for those sanctions to be lifted by codifying them into law. So as we head into today's sessions, we come out of a kind of head-spinning time in thinking about US relations with Russia, and a number of you here, in January, a lot of people thought the sanctions were about to be lifted. Some of us were at a conference, a lot of Russia people, late January, we were hearing the sanctions were about to be lifted within 24 hours, right? And here we are a year later. So I want to raise 5 questions that I think would like to suggest of these things as themes that we can think about to sort of wind our different panels together. And at the end of the day, Henry and Marlene and I will lead an open session for discussion. And maybe we can return to these questions at the end of the day. But sort of questions to pose, things to think about, and ways to sort of conceptualize across all of the many presentations we're going to hear today. And maybe we can think about having some answers to them by the end of the day. So the first question is, have relations between Russia and the West actually changed in the year since Donald Trump was elected? Like, this promised to be a momentous change. Have they changed? If so, how have they changed? In what areas have they changed? Have they changed in some ways for the better? Have they changed in some ways for the worst? Second question. 1 year in, right, if people ask you, what's the state of Russia's relations with the West? How would you describe that, right? Is it right to say that we're in a new Cold War, as some people describe it? Should we be describing this as a period of stability, something not necessarily often attached to the Trump administration, but nevertheless, if nothing's changed in recent times, should we be talking that as a period of stability in Russia's relations with the West? Or are we in a period of instability, with norms that were sort of potentially antagonistic norms, but at least some norms and some commonalities accepted for the last 8 years that have been upended? Third, looking forward, what is the prognosis for Russia's relations with the West in the near to midterm? Are we optimistic that ties might improve? Do we expect further deterioration? And in either of these cases, what would this look like? What would deterioration look like? How could it get worse? What would improvement look like? A fourth question. How much will domestic politics determine the evolution of this relationship going forward? We're going to hear a lot about the relations between the countries, but how much do we need to be looking at domestic politics? And I'm talking here, we can talk about US domestic politics. First and foremost, the Mueller investigation. We recently had a packed event here at the Jordan Center on Russia's role in the 2016 elections. But we also have midterm elections coming up in the United States. Midterm elections, which may I add you, those of you who were flying in here and traveling and trying to get in the rainstorm may have missed this, but now look a bit different than they did 24 hours ago, right? Where Donald Trump's 37% approval rating, which previously was, well, pollsters got the 2016 election wrong, so the 37 approval rating must be masking the fact that he's massively popular just with people not answering surveys, now looks like it may be a yoke around the neck of candidates running, Republicans running for office, in particularly in US suburbs. Well, how will that play out and change something about Russia's relations with the US at least? Russian domestic politics. We, of course, have the Russian presidential election coming up in the next year, and we are then going to be entering into, perhaps, we will then be entering into Putin's final term following that election. The day that election's over, we're now into, hypothetically, perhaps the last term of Putin. How will that have an effect? What about European domestic politics? There's an awful lot of upheaval in elections in Europe. So how much will that play into Western Europe's relations with Russia? Then finally, I'm going to throw out a last question, which some of you have heard me talk about this before. But I want to provocatively throw out there as a fifth question that we can consider today, is whether Russia is the dog that caught the car in terms of the US presidential elections. So, and I will assume, and I have no inside information on this whatsoever, but let's assume for the moment, for the sake of academic argument, that the Russians were interested in seeing Donald Trump win the US presidential elections. Since this has come to bear, has this actually been a net benefit for Russia? Would Russia, and especially would Putin and would the Kremlin, have been better off with a Clinton victory and a status quo in US-Russian relations? So let me ask a few questions in this regard. First of all, having had public displays of appreciation for Trump's victory, followed by very public displays of insinuations that Russia may have had something to do with that, does Russia somehow own Trump's foreign policy? After years of Putin being able to blame everything wrong at the foot of Clinton and Obama and at the US, is that now suddenly a harder move to pull off domestically? Is it harder to blame Trump is it harder to blame the US in the context of Russian politics, since this was the preferred candidate? Or is this not the case? Is it very easy to make this pivot, and we can just expect to see if Trump goes too far for Russia's taste that they can pivot, right? From the point of view of international relations theory, we know in a lot of formal models of negotiations, the worst situation to find yourself in is when you have no idea what your negotiating partner is going to do, because you can't plan your strategy accordingly, right? Would Russia have been better off with a status quo that it understood in how the West tended to react to things, assuming there would be kind of a strong degree of continuity in a Clinton administration from an Obama administration, than having a completely unpredictable negotiating partner at the team? Maybe we're going to hear something about the 59 missiles that ended up launched into Syria and how that was received in the Kremlin, right? What would have happened to the sanctions in the aftermath of Donald Trump losing the election, right? I think a lot of us thought, well, Donald Trump winning the election could have meant to a lessening of the sanctions, but it hasn't. It's actually made it harder to get rid of the sanctions. Is Russia's position vis-a-vis Ukraine, vis-a-vis Syria, vis-a-vis these foreign policy inhibitions, is that actually worse than it would have been under a Clinton administration? So I can go on this, but the question is, having known everything it knows now, right, is Russia the dog that the dog that caught the car? When you catch the car, you don't know what to do with it. Or is Russia better off, is its position in the international sphere better off strengthened by what's going on in US foreign policy? So I'm throwing out those 5 questions as some themes that we can try to have to sort of tie together discussion of the day. There'll be opportunities to hear from lots of them, I'm sure, from the panelists. We will have limited time for discussion following each of the panels because we had so many people who wanted to participate. We should hopefully have 10 or 15 minutes for questions following the panel, but we have reserved a whole final session at the end of the day with no presentations, which will lead to give everyone a chance to sort of synthesize, weigh in on these ties. So with that, let me welcome you once again to NYU and to the Jordan Center on behalf of the Jordan Center and PONARS, and let me turn it over to our first panel. I guess we'll just have people, we have name tags. Why don't you just introduce yourself when you go to speak, and we'll go across, unless we have any other preferred way of doing. Okay, and in an effort to get as much of today focused on the discussion, we do not have assigned discussants here. So we're going to give each of the panelists between 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up immediately to questions in whatever time is left. So let's just, for the sake of keeping this consistent, let's just go left to right, and we'll start off with Vladimir. And if you could please introduce yourself for our audience as well, and for our audience here, that would be fantastic. So thanks very much, everybody. Looking forward to an incredibly interesting and stimulating day.
Well, thank you so much. Actually, the order of the presentations which is announced in the program is different. I am okay to go first. But,
okay. All right, let's do that. Yeah, that's fine. In case we have people who have tried to time this for particular groupies of particular PONARS fans, we'll go in the order. Okay, so let's start with Arkady Moshes then. I'll read off. So Arkady Moshes, Finnish Institute of International Affairs, on Russian foreign policy. What is coming to replace Trump-Euphoria?
I was afraid Arkady is not going to forgive me, so I...
Yeah, okay, yeah. Oh, that's a good
Too late.
That's fine, I haven't woken up anymore. Good morning, and let me start by thanking PONARS and the Jordan Center for the opportunity to be here. What I tried to do in my memo was to actually analyze quite a number of publications which appeared in summer this year, papers discussing the future, the immediate future, and maybe more long-distant future of the Russian foreign policy. And in my understanding, the very fact that these papers appeared, written by authors working with the Russian International Affairs Council, Russian Council on Foreign and Defense Policy, some people working with Moscow Carnegie Center who are representative of the Russian thinking nevertheless, and some other things. The fact that these papers appeared was a sign to me, was a revelation that something serious was going on in Moscow in terms of reassessment. And that was already a reaction and realization that the early euphoria, which was there immediately after the Trump election, had gone. Euphoria was definitely there, and many of us remember how champagne was uncorked in the Russian State Duma to celebrate the fact of Trump's election, but even serious commentators were writing very upbeat stuff about how the things would now develop. I'm citing in my memo Mr. Sergei Karaganov, a very well-experienced pundit, and at some point in the past a policy influencer. He was writing, quote, that Russia was winning practically in all directions, qualitatively strengthening its international positions. That's a paper which appeared in January this year. He went on saying that the forces that wanted to defeat Russia, to destroy its economy and to bring about the regime change were retreating. Globalist and ideology-driven elite had lost in the US, while its European branches were losing in, quote, one European country after another. So this was the mood. The mood was that basically there was an expectation of the deal, lifting of the sanctions, recognition of Russia's special interest, and all that. And then we know what happened. The US position on Ukraine didn't change. Josh mentioned these missiles which struck on the Syrian governmental forces. It took an embarrassing 6 months before a very small meeting between Putin and Trump could take place. And whatever the results of that meeting were, nobody remembers them anymore, simply because it was all overshadowed by the sanctions, by the embassy scandals, and basically now the relationship is at a new low. So the euphoria was gone, and as some of these Russian thinkers admitted, Russia was again at the drawing board. So the expectations that things would be fixed soon and to Russia's likings, these expectations were no longer there. So this is what I'm doing in the memo. I'm analyzing this text, and I'm grouping my findings into 3 themes which people discuss. It's the relations with the West, or the future relations with the West, the future relations with Asia, or Greater Eurasia, to be precise, and the post-Soviet space. So the first theme is the relationship with the West, and there's one striking conclusion, that the times of even when people could even think about possible, potential, comprehensive partnership, those times are over. And of course it is the West that is to be blamed, and we know the story because it did not recognize exactly Russia's, if not a veto, then at least a critical say in international relations. This is not new. What is a bit new is that there is a very strong line of reasoning that it is now the West that perceives Russia as a challenge and a source of problems. And more interesting is that according to Russian perceptions, the West perceives Russia as an enemy, and the West needs Russia to overcome its own internal crisis. And some people even go as far as saying that this is Western new ideology. This is basically the evolution. This is where the perception of the West is moving somewhere into the new stage. Consequently, there are expectations that the West would be quite tough on Russia, that it would be pressurizing Russia. But what is interesting is that Kremlin is not going to make any concessions. As for instance, Dmitry Trenin from the Moscow Carnegie Center wrote, start of the quote, "The Kremlin has no intention of stepping back or reconciling itself with the West through concessions and promises of improved behavior." End of quote. This is a very straightforward answer. So there are these expectations that the West would be unfriendly, even inimical towards Russia. But Russia is not going to concede anything. Consequently, and this is interesting, or at least this is the logic that is applied, since Russia is not going to make any concessions, it is up to the West to make concessions. So if the West wants better relationship, it is the West that has to make concessions. Clearly turning the Ukrainian page, or bracketing this, clearly admitting that there would be no further plans of enlarging EU and NATO, and so on and so forth. The next interesting point is that there's practically no discussion about whether or not the current level of sanctions is a problem for Russia. The answer is no. The answer is it's not a problem. The answer is that Russia can easily cope with the current level of sanctions. However, and this is where, let's say, this officially non-governmental, even though mainstream analysts somewhat probably disagree with the official position, is that these authors clearly see that if it continues like that, in the long run, even this level of sanctions might be a problem. There will be economic costs and economic losses. And therefore, Russia should seek some kind of transactional relationship with Europe in particular. And the role of European trade for Russia is clearly recognized. But of course, there are expectations that Europe will recognize Russia's special role globally, not only regionally. So basically, to make a long story short, there are expectations of, and actually choice of, a managed conflict as opposed to return to the partnership, but not all-out confrontation. Kind of the confrontation contained at the current level is fine. Escalation of the confrontation is not viewed as something that would be in Russia's interests, but certainly not partnership. I don't know how much this line of reasoning, how important it could be for the United States. For Europe, it definitely is, because in Europe you still have the "we need Russia" discourse. And these people expect, or these people argue that it is so it should be so obvious for everybody that Russia-EU cooperation is in everybody's interests, that as soon as Europe makes advances and overtures, Russia will understand that it is in its interest to also kind of walk its half of the way. This is not going to happen, and this is something that the Europeans should learn. The second big theme, as I said, is Greater Eurasia. This is actually very interesting, because this is where you see that the thinking is internally contradictory. This is not completely new, because we remember that ages ago, Putin, during his previous campaign, he was writing about the need for Russia to catch China's economic winds into Russia's sails. Quite a lot of publications have been appearing throughout the years. But what is interesting now is that now Russia goes beyond China. At least in these writings, there is a very consistent attempt not to speak about pivot to Asia, but to speak about this Greater Eurasia, which is a much more ambitious project, because it includes China, it includes harmonization of Russian and Chinese initiatives in Central Asia and in wider Asia. But basically, there are all these very interesting ideas that Russia should be able to play a balancing role in Asia as a whole, to help managing contradictions between China and India, India and Pakistan, Pakistan and Afghanistan, Iran and some other countries. And this is really, really very ambitious project that meanwhile Russia should be able to achieve breakthrough in its relations with South Korea and Japan, and in its economic relations with ASEAN countries. This looks very impressive, like party Congress's programs 25 years ago. A lot of promises. What is interesting is that the same people actually see how weak Russian position in the East is. They do see that China is not interested in a close alliance. The same Trenin writes, start of the quote, "For myriad reasons, Russia is not interested in a close alliance with Russia, even one it would clearly dominate." And kind of, it's not that you will find it all in one text, but you find this argumentation scattered around several texts, where people analyze realistically the results of the politically driven rapprochement of the last 3 years. That China got what it wanted from Russia in terms of energy, in terms of weapons exports, in terms of access to some other, basically in terms of access to Central Asia and so on, and it doesn't feel the need to invest into this relationship more than it has invested already. There is a recognition that China is not really interested in Russia's retaking or regaining the role, the status of a great power. People see clearly that China will not support Russia in its conflict with Washington, that it has quite a serious agenda to pursue in relations with the United States. And that even when it comes to economic projects, there's no easy Chinese money for Russia. Russia will have to seriously compete for the investment. You can also find texts going into details and showing that it's actually very difficult to harmonize Russian projects for Central Asia and the Chinese projects for the Belt and Road Initiative. And people also see that Russian economy actually would not, in its current state, would not sustain the same status and the role that these same people are prescribing for Russia to do. And in that sense, it's very contradictory. Finally, when it comes to the post-Soviet space, this is, for me, is the most interesting part, because this is where these analysts clearly contradict, are at odds with the official position. The official position is still that there's a great future for the post-Soviet reintegration, Eurasian Union is thriving and all that, and there's nothing like that in this text. Russian International Affairs Council clearly advocates that Russia should finally kind of unbound, open up this post-Soviet paradigm and go beyond it, and it should invite more participants. It should not continue the policy when it was considering this region as a zone of its exclusive influence. And there are three reasons for that, basically. One is that people see clearly that Ukraine is lost. That Ukraine is lost forever, that Ukraine will not be a partner, that Ukraine will treat Russia as an enemy again. And without Ukraine, post-Soviet exclusive reintegration makes a lot less sense. They also see that Eurasian Economic Union, well, they avoid words like stagnation, but they clearly see that this is not a vehicle for the supranational political reintegration. And they cannot deny that if they continue their process of rapprochement with China, any attempts to have exclusive influence in Central Asia will be futile. So that's been already opened. Basically, opening the post-Soviet space conceptually would only mean recognition of the facts. So my conclusion is that the message that you can find, messages, but they are converging, they're very clear. It's non-confrontational, but a non-cooperational relationship with the West. It's this very upbeat thinking about Russia's role in Asia, continuation of pivot to Asia, and much less forthcoming attitudes towards post-Soviet space. The problem is that we don't know to what extent this thinking that I studied in these publications reflect the thinking in Kremlin. And this is something which is not possible for me to even assume. I would probably think that these texts reflect the discussion somewhat, and they are a signal of what is being discussed behind closed doors, but it's not the whole story. Because Putin can still continue running the show the way he has been running the show up until now, behaving as a leader of a besieged fortress. And if that is the case, then the problems are still ahead, and euphoria has gone, but the zero-sum game thinking is still there. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much, Arkady. Next up, we have Vladimir Popov from the Dialogue of Civilizations Research Institute now in Berlin.
Thank you so much.
And he will be speaking on why is the United States so tough on Russia. The answer may be in the Lenin brochure of 1920.
Yes, the title is on the board. Thank you so much. And of course, the reference to the Lenin's brochure is appropriate, but this is just to catch your attention. Those who knows me probably know that usually I present papers on economic issues. I was doing something on economics of development, economics of transition, on Russian economy. But now, probably this is one of the first essays or papers on issues which are usually discussed by political scientists. The reason I decided to do that is it seems to me that there is an obvious misunderstanding between expert communities in Russia and in the United States. The perceptions are so different, and this is the attempt maybe to bridge these perceptions, and also it seems like there are obvious things that are not being discussed, and I'm trying to get your reaction. Yes, I'll put some arguments on the table, and I'm trying to get your reaction to those things that are not discussed. What is the problem? The problem is that never before the Russian-American relations were so bad, even during the Cold War, I would say, and today Russia is a capitalist market economy, and today Russia is definitely more democratic than the regime of the Soviet Union. And today Russia is weaker than the Soviet Union, militarily and economically, and it doesn't have such an influence in the world as the former Soviet Union. So why not to have better relations with Russia? Even before the current campaign about Russian hackers that undermine US democracy, the Russian-American relations degraded to the level not seen since the 1950s, and apparently there is no explanation to that. In the 1970s, it was impossible to imagine that such arrogant tone of the US officials would be used also in the media. And it was not possible to imagine that the officials, Soviet officials, will be prohibited from traveling to the West. If you recall the, say, periods of 1970s, yes, there was Vietnam in 1970s, there were other events, the collapse of the last colonial empire, Portuguese empire, there was Iran, and even after the sanctions, which were introduced in 1980 by Reagan after the Russian moved the troops to Afghanistan, even then the relations do not appear to be as bad as they are today. And today, when I say today, it means after 2014, after the Crimean sanctions. Now, this is trade. Trade is a very sensitive indicator. This is a logarithmic scale. This is a total trade turnover, which is export and imports in billions of dollars, billions of current dollars. It's billions of current dollars, so it is supposed to increase all the time, just because there is inflation going on, and just because the trade usually increases faster than GDP, so it's supposed to increase by about 10% a year. Normally, between other countries, it increases by, say, 10% a year. You may see that the major increase in the Russian-American trade took place in the 1960s and 1970s. And once again, in the 1960s, if you think about 1960s, there were Caribbean crisis, Berlin crisis, there were this Powers spy plane incident, there were 1967 Arab-Israeli war, then there were 1968 Soviet troops in Afghanistan. Yes, there were no sanctions, by the way, after the Soviet in Czechoslovakia, right? After the Soviet Union moved the troops to Czechoslovakia, there were no sanctions. And the sanctions that were introduced after the 79 Soviet troops in Afghanistan were moved to Afghanistan. In 1980, Reagan introduced those sanctions. Even those sanctions were not, as bad, did not bring relations with Russia to as low level as they are today. So the question is, why it is happening today? Why did the fastest expansion of bilateral trade occur in 16 and 70s? During the 70s is the period of detente. But even during 60s, when there was still a Cold War, trade was expanding much faster than it does today, because today trade actually goes down. We cannot see it behind the NYU Jordan Center poster, but just believe me that it is currently going down. Now, there are several explanations. One explanation is, of course, geopolitics, because the Russian, now I cannot resist the lure to show you the trade. Thank you so much, Josh. Yes, now you can see that it is actually going down, whereas under normal circumstances, it is supposed to increase by about 10% a year because of normal inflation and normal growth, and trade growth is higher than GDP growth. So now, what are the explanations? Well, usual explanation. And the explanations are very different on both sides, in Russia and in the United States. One explanation is the renewed Russian expansion. As Russia moved the troops to Crimea, now eastern Ukraine, Syria, and so on. But think about 1970s. As I said, there was a Vietnam right, the American troops, southern Vietnam became part of the North Vietnam. The American troops were evacuated from Vietnam. Now then there was Angola and Mozambique, and when the Portuguese colonial empire collapsed. Now then there were all kinds of other developments, and in the 1970s there were no sanctions basically, and there was a detente, and I remember there was a meeting between Brezhnev and Nixon, I think, and it was right after the mines were they put around the Hanoi port, I think, and the meeting was not yet cancelled. So there was an understanding that those relations have much greater value than conflicts in different regions of the world. Now the other explanation is, of course, Russian hackers. But first, Russian hackers emerged, this issue of the Russian hackers that threatened US democracy emerged only recently, yes, in recent 1 year and a half maybe. And the relations deteriorated since Crimea, basically. Even since 2014, they're very bad. And second, the Russians say that, assume for the purpose of academic argument that Russian hackers are really, doing a lot of bad things and trying to influence the results of American elections. But Americans are doing the same things, and not only Americans are doing the same things in many countries of the world, Americans are doing even worse things. Americans are exploding centrifuges in Iran, for instance. Americans are, bombing countries in without the resolution of Security Council and so on. So there should be, if there are intelligences on both sides of the border, there should be kind of agreement between intelligences. What is possible, what is the allowed hacking, and what is not allowed hacking. And of course Russia will welcome this kind of agreement because Russian capacity to do the electronic intelligence is much weaker than the capacity of the United States. So this is also not an explanation. So what is my explanation that I'm trying to put on the table? The explanation is that there is a relative balance of forces and the perception of the elite about this relative balance of forces. Now the reason that detente happened is because the Soviet Union became militarily and economically virtually as powerful as the United States. And because of this balance of forces, when you see that your counterpart is getting very mighty, you try to negotiate things with the counterpart. Now, you can see the balance, these are the nuclear warheads. It's only in 1950s and 60s, the number of nuclear warheads in the Soviet Union was not several times, not 10 or 20% lower. It was something like 10% only of the level of the United States. And if you want the balance of the strategic nuclear carriers, which includes ICBMs in intercontinental ballistic missiles, land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, bombers, strategic bombers, and the submarine-based ballistic missiles. Then, once again, this strategic balance was very much in favor of the United States. It's only when the Soviet Union approached the level of the United States detente became possible. The same is true with the economic might of the two countries. The only period when the Soviet Union or Russia was catching up with the United States was the period when the communists were in power. Basically, it was from 1920, when there was the lowest level of production after the First World War and after the Civil War in the Soviet Union. During new economic policy, during 1930s it was catching up, then there was a war. You can see this on the chart, which is the second fall in output. This shows the GDP per capita in Russia as a percentage of the United States. So, and then after the war in 1950s and in 1960s and until 1975, the Russian GDP per capita, Russian per capita income as compared to the United States was growing. And in 1975 it reached the highest point, and only after 75 it started to decline. And at that time, in 1975, it actually turned out that the Soviet Union is not an alternative economic system to capitalism. And it's actually, the Soviet Union, the Russian bear, didn't look at that time that frightening. Because after 75 it was clear that the Soviet Union is not catching up. Its economic system is not an alternative. It's not viable because, it's falling behind all the time. And then things like, Reagan and sanctions became possible. Now, this is the analogy. The analogy is that Lenin said that there was a mistake. Several times Lenin said that our policy was a mistake. Those who know Lenin's works, like my generation, would know some of the Lenin's works. The work is actually the leftist, the infantile disease of leftism in communism, детская болезнь левизны в коммунизме. He admitted that the boycott of the elections to the first Russian Duma that took place in 1906 was a mistake. Why? He said, well, because we thought revolutions is going uphill and that the Tsarist government will be thrown out in 1 or 2 years, and then it doesn't make sense to participate in elections organized by this government. But we were mistaken, because at that time revolution was already going downhill, because the highest point of revolution was the Moscow rebellion, in Moscow uprising in 1905, in December 1905. And since that time revolution is going downhill, so you're supposed to use all kinds of ways to fight the Tsarist government, to fight the authoritarian Tsarist regime. Or legal ways and also illegal ways. Legal ways participating in election in the State Duma, and also illegal ways preparing the new revolution. So the same probably is the explanation today for the bad relations. Maybe the American establishment basically thinks, and this is true about establishment in both parties, that Russia is not going to go up. Russia is going down, and the relative position of the United States and the West against Russia are improving. In this case, why do you want to negotiate with Russia? Maybe in several years down the road it will fall apart, or there will be a new government that will make concessions that are required by the United States and so on. Now, the question is whether Russia is going up or down. And of course, everyone in this room, I'm sure, has a definite opinion on the issue. It's not such an easy question, because in the short term, I would say the Russian economy, yes, because I'm watching the Russian economy, I can make predictions, economic predictions. And I would say that in the short term, and even in the medium term, there is no chance that the Russian economy will catch up successfully with the Western countries and with China and South Korea, and Korea in several years would be united probably, so with the East Asian countries, including not Northeast Asia, but also Southeast Asia. But in the long term, it's difficult to say, military balance is another story. And in the long term, it's difficult to, military balance can be maintained for some time today, for several years or maybe dozens of years. But in the long term, it may well be that, Russian economy will do worse than the United States. But for the medium term, it seems like the prediction is such that, I have only 5 minutes? These are the conclusions. I was going to end, right? So maybe, yeah,
no, that's fine if you can get it.
Maybe, yeah, thank you. But maybe I stop here to save some time. If you have questions, I would be interested more in your reaction. So thank you so much for that.
Okay. Thanks very much, Vladimir. Up next is Kimberly Marten from Barnard College, Columbia University, and she is going to be explaining Russia's schizophrenic policy towards the United States.
Thank you, Joshua.
And,
thank you,
yeah,
PONARS. Thank you, Jordan Center, and thank you all for being here and listening to us today. I'm really looking forward to your reactions to this, because this is part of a bigger project that I'm doing on trying to explain recent Russian foreign policy towards the United States. So I want to make the argument that we have in mind that Putin is a master at foreign policy and at achieving what he wants to achieve in international security. And I kind of agree with the point that Joshua was making, that I think in this situation, we have a situation where Putin has caught the car. And the question is, how do we explain the weaknesses and inconsistencies of recent Russian policy towards the United States? Because I think there are inconsistencies, and I don't think Russia got what it wanted. And there are two issues that really stand out in my mind. The first is that in one sense, Russia seems to have gotten very accurate data about how to influence US public opinion in the lead up to the 2016 elections. And so we know that, for example, the timing of the release of the damning emails from the Democratic National Committee came out just 2 days before the Democratic National Convention came out. The emails that were doxed from John Podesta came out the day that Trump was accused by, or the tape came out of Trump making a statement about it was okay to abuse women. And it took the media focus off of Trump's statements immediately and put it on Podesta instead. So that seemed to be very sophisticated in its targeting. We also know that at least some of the fake advertising that appeared on Facebook was very sophisticated. There have been articles that have shown that not all of it was. Some of it was kind of stupid and crazy. But some of them were very well targeted to issues that really mattered a great deal to divisions in the United States on racial questions, on immigration questions, and so forth. So that was just really, really smart. And yet, the Kremlin seems to have been completely taken off guard by the resulting ramp up of US sanctions. And it's surprising that they were surprised, because it's the exact same pattern that we saw in the Magnitsky Act in 2012, where a president who didn't really want to put sanctions against Russia had his hand forced by congressional leaderships. And so it should not have been a surprise that Congress would still want sanctions. The second thing that's surprising to me is that we now know from a secret document that was released and then was confirmed by both sides, by both the US and the Russian side, that in the spring of 2017, the Putin administration really wanted to have a whole-scale reset of relations with the United States that was done in great depth, point by point, of where they wanted to go. And yet simultaneous to this proposal that was a secret reset policy, not something that was done for propaganda purposes, simultaneously, Russia continued actions around the world that threatened core US security interests. And so the second puzzle is, how could they have believed that this reset was possible at a time when they were doing nothing to stop threatening US core interests in NATO, in Ukraine, Syria, North Korea, even Venezuela? How do you explain these things? So that's the puzzle that I have. How do you explain these inconsistencies? And I want to give you 4 possible explanations. The first explanation is that Putin just succumbed to his own lack of knowledge about US politics and Putin's own personal biases. We don't have any evidence that Putin was ever somebody who studied US domestic politics, and so it makes sense that maybe he just didn't know how Congress worked and wasn't able to think about this, had ideas in his own mind. And the Brookings Institution, Stephen Piker, has said this, that, quote, Putin doesn't seem to understand that Trump's powers are not the same as his. The checks and balances, the special prosecutor, and congressional investigations have tied Trump's hands in ways that didn't occur to Putin, unquote. If this is the correct explanation, it also fits with Putin's interaction with an earlier president, namely George W. Bush. So we know from journalistic writings that came out during the Bush administration that, for example, Putin said to Bush, well, why can't you just change the Constitution to give yourself a 3rd term in office? And that Putin also said to Bush, good deal on firing that Dan Rather after he had that bad information about you, with just a complete misunderstanding that Bush couldn't change the Constitution and that Bush wasn't responsible for firing Dan Rather. And so there's evidence that this explanation would fit in terms of Putin's biases and Putin's lack of knowledge. So this is a reasonable explanation for the outcome, but it begs another question. If this was really how Putin approached things, why didn't any of his own advisors try to wake him up and say, wait a second, this isn't what you should be thinking about, that's not how the US system works, Trump is not like you, and therefore there are other things involved. Now, I know from my personal experience that there's very good analysis available in Russia about US politics. And some of the analysts who are so good at that are in this audience. But there's another institute that is not represented, I don't think, in this audience, the Institute of USA and Canada Studies, that certainly knows an awful lot about how the United States works. And so the question is, with all of this information available, why didn't Putin have a better idea? Why didn't some of his advisors talk to him about it? Well, as Dmitry Trenin, who we've heard a quote from before, of the Carnegie Moscow Center, publicly stated, and as other top Russian international affairs analysts have said privately, the Kremlin has basically ignored Russian think tanks for many years. Putin doesn't listen. And Putin is also believed to have largely sidelined the foreign ministry. And so that means that all of the expertise inside the Russian foreign ministry about dealing with the United States, certainly the people who are at the top in the Russian foreign ministry have been there for many years, and they have a very good sense of how the US operates. He may just not be paying attention to them. And this leads to the second explanation of what's going on, that Putin's advisors may be afraid to tell him the truth. And this has been suggested by the journalist Mikhail Zygar, and I would argue that it also fits a pattern of dictatorships around the world. So for example, we know that this was true for Saddam Hussein in his last years as the leader in Iraq. We know that Saddam Hussein's advisors understood that the US was going to invade Iraq, but Saddam Hussein kept on insisting that the US would never invade Iraq. We also know that Saddam Hussein refused to give up the charade that he actually had weapons of mass destruction that he was trying to hide because he was convinced that it made it appear to his enemies that he had strength, that he didn't want to take that perception of strength away. And we know these things because after the US invasion, there were a number of people who did a lot of in-depth interviews of Iraqi officials who told them this, and they also had, of course, a lot of the archives released, and so we knew what was going on at an internal level. And so this is a danger that all dictators face, that they don't want to hear bad news, and people are afraid of telling them bad news because, if you're in Saddam Hussein's Iraq, you might lose your life. But if you're in Vladimir Putin's Russia, you may not lose your life, but you may lose your access to all of the goodies that you get from being in a high-level position, and that might mean that your patronage network gets destroyed. So this leads to another implication, which is that if Putin is relying on very narrow information channels and is not listening to a wide variety of perspectives on what's happening in the world, particular individuals may be able to sway him in directions that serve their interests rather than serving Russia's overall national interests. And this leads to explanation 3, that inconsistent foreign policy might be the result of infighting in Putin's inner circle. And I would argue that we really don't know who Putin's inner circle is. Every time that some Russian analyst comes up with this list of who the people are who are on their way up and who the people are who are on their way down, immediately some other analyst inside Russia will say, no, 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 you got it all wrong. That isn't actually what's happening. And the truth is, nobody really knows. We know that Putin doesn't come into the Kremlin very often lately, so whatever is happening at his dacha. And, we really don't understand who is potentially having an influence on him. So let me give you 2 examples of where people that might be close advisors of Putin might be giving him contradictory information and contradictory advice. And that might explain the seemingly contradictory policies that Russia has adopted towards the United States. So one example is Sergei Chemezov, who is the CEO of Rostec, the big conglomerate firm that is responsible for the vast majority of Russian weapons sales. Rostec has a very strong interest in the profitability of Russian arms sales, and that means that if you follow through on an interest-based argument, Chemezov has a very strong interest in having conflict in the world, not only for the benefit of his corporation, but also because every time he signs a contract, he can take a little bit off the top of it for himself. So that might explain why he would have an interest in continuing to see conflict in places like Ukraine, in places like Syria. We also know from the analysis of Alexander Gabuyev of the Carnegie Moscow Center that Russia has chosen recently to sell late-generation weapons to China, even though there is a long history of China taking those weapons designs, essentially stealing them and reselling them on the international market and becoming a major competitor of Russia on the international weapons market. Still, something like the S-400 is being sold to China these days. What about the Turkish S-400 ballistic missile defense system that may or may not be going forward? The way that it's been presented is that Russia is trying to draw Turkey away from the NATO orbit, but Turkey seems to go back and forth. It's not very consistent in its policy towards the external world. Another way of looking at it is that if Turkey gets that S-400 system and things go back in another direction in Turkey, that means NATO gets the S-400 system. And if Russia actually sells the S-400 system to Turkey, that'll be the first time that a U.S. ally has direct access to what an S-400 system looks like. And I talked to a friend of mine who's an expert and he said, yeah, the U.S. would really like to get a sense of what is going on with the codes that are used in the S-400 system, because that's something that could be used against NATO in various places in the area of confrontation. In contrast, Igor Sechin, who's also a very good friend of Putin, like Chemezov, has the intelligence agency past that would tie him to Putin, seems to be a pretty good friend with Chemezov in many ways. Nonetheless, as the CEO of Rosneft, he's been very strongly affected by the sanctions and would very much probably like to have those sanctions lifted. And he's a good friend of Rex Tillerson. There are lots of pictures of him and Rex Tillerson with their arms around each other. And so he might be very interested in having much better relations with the United States and might be giving advice to Putin that is directly in contrast with the advice that Sergei Chemezov is giving Putin, again, for very self-interested reasons. This actually leads to a 4th explanation, because what Chemezov and Sechin both have in common, in addition to their affiliation with Putin going way back, is an affiliation with Russian intelligence agencies, with different Russian intelligence agencies. So Chemezov is known to have probably a KGB background. He served with Putin in Dresden many years ago. Sechin is believed to have been in the Russian military intelligence agency, the GRU, when he served in Mozambique as a translator. So the 4th explanation is it could be that various representatives of this web of Russian intelligence agencies are acting in ways that are not necessarily consistent with each other, and that we see infighting that doesn't really fit the bureaucratic infighting model, but that is a model of different networks of people infighting to try to get Putin's ears. And in part, it is that they came from different agencies, and Russia the Soviet Union never had a tradition of coming together of intelligence agencies the way that we see in the United States. There's never any kind of a joint assessment that came out of various intelligence agencies in Russia or the Soviet Union. And we know that throughout Soviet history, there was really massive infighting among intelligence agencies that was, in Stalin's era, it was deadly. But in later eras, it certainly continued at a very high level. Is that 5 minutes?
5,
yeah. Okay. And in addition to that infighting between agencies, there's something else that we should think about when we think about members of intelligence agencies in Russia, which there has never been that sort of ideal model of intelligence agencies staying out of politics, which we would expect to have when we're thinking about the way that intelligence agencies operate in countries in various places in the world. In fact, lots of people who came out of those intelligence agencies are now serving in very high-level positions in the Russian government and also in Russian commerce. And you can make the argument that the distinction between commerce and intelligence really broke down in the 1990s and has become strong ever since then. And we also know, because of press reports that have appeared in the Russian press for the past 15 years, that in addition to the large-scale business interests of various Russian intelligence agencies and agents, there have been a lot of criminality that goes on. And so, the Russian intelligence agencies are not necessarily in sync with what the Russian state wants to have in mind. And the one piece of evidence that we have of this, and do with it what you will, because it's hard to get evidence on this, but Sergei Ivanov, who attended KGB training school with Putin and has served him in a variety of roles in the FSB over the past 20 years, has been suggested by the Steele dossier. And you can do what you want with the Steele dossier, but a lot of people believe that even though it has factual errors, parts of it may be telling the truth about what happened in Russia. The Steele dossier suggests that Sergei Ivanov was let go in August 2016 from his position as Putin's chief of staff, because it was Sergei Ivanov who had responsibility for the decision not to do the hacking, but to do the doxing, the release of documents that came out from Russian intelligence agencies about the DNC and about John Podesta and so forth. And take what you will, may not be true. There are lots of rumors about why Sergei Ivanov was let go, but this is one piece of evidence that we have that there may be members of the intelligence organizations who are acting in a way that is not necessarily in sync with each other and not necessarily in sync with overall Russian national interests. So what are the ultimate implications for U.S.-Russia relations from this? Well, while there's no question that Putin remains the decider on Russian foreign policy, I think we should consider the possibility that his advisors may have their own agendas and may have the ability to switch the agenda in various ways that Putin is not fully in control of, because he may not have full information or full control over things. And as we know, Putin is aging. Enthusiasm for his rule, he's still popular, but the enthusiasm is waning in Russia. I think that there's a good chance that means that his various advisors will be jockeying to be his replacement, and that jockeying might start even before the next presidential term is over. And so what we should expect is a growing power struggle that might have an effect on Russian foreign policy and Russian policy towards the United States, that it may be time to bring back old-style Kremlinology, and that what the U.S. does towards Russia may not be the primary thing that's influencing what goes on in Russian politics towards the United States, that we may have two little spiral models that are operating independently of each other, with U.S. domestic politics and Russian domestic politics potentially clashing, but not really necessarily paying all that much attention to each other.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, our next speaker is Polina Sunovets from the Odessa National University, and she'll be speaking on the new U.S. administration and arms control with Russia.
Dear audience, unfortunately, my presentation is not so comprehensive, and it's concentrating on a very narrow set of issues, but I'm mostly dealing with the strategic nuclear policy. So what I'm going to describe briefly is Russian nuclear policy, because it's very much defined in comparison with the U.S. with the U.S. nuclear policy, which is still in the process of formation. So we know that Russia is practicing the escalation for the escalation strategy, like possibility of using nuclear weapons in the regional war just to escalate the war in case if some third side interferes. Also that European missile defense and NATO enlargement is considered to be the main dangers for the Russian security for many years, probably since 2010. That Russia is actively working on its nuclear strategic modernization, and not only strategic modernization, that the ICBM Sarmat SS-26 RS-26 is still in the process of testing, and it's not very successful, but anyway, it will be released in the closest years. substituting SS-18s, coming still from the Soviet Union, that Russia is deploying sea-launched cruise missiles Caliber, presumably in Crimea, and therefore all NATO European part will be vulnerable for Russian strike. Also air-launched cruise missiles, X-101, X-102, which is also having a possibility to strike NATO states, and which is the main peculiarity of Caliber and X-101 and 102, that both versions has nuclear and conventional versions. And also the deployment of SSC-8, which is a mysterious missile threatening to collapse the INF Treaty, but I will speak about this later. So today, what problems are on agenda of Russian-US relations in the strategic nuclear field, and not only strategic, but in the other. They are the INF Treaty of 1987 and the New START Treaty. So why the New START Treaty is actual? Because it was concluded in 2010 for 10 years, but presumably in the beginning of the next year, it should be already implemented. I mean, the levels of reductions from the Russian and the US side. So those are the conditions of the treaty. So I don't think that it's worth to describe them, because I will talk about some things later. So the good news, of course, we have the good news here. Fortunately, because as what we see as for the New START Treaty, that both sides are in a almost full implementation of this treaty, and it was not looking like that even in April of this year, when Russia had about like 200 nuclear warheads deployed more than it has now. Now it came to the full implementation. I mean, these are the statistics from October 1st of this year. So you see that both sides are very close to implementing the New START Treaty, and it's probably very easy to do up to the beginning of the next year. So probably the New START is okay. The only question is whether it would be extended for the 5 more years after 2020, because the whole spirit of Russian-US relations are not very inspiring to give such a positive prognosis. But you know, everything may happen. So the other thing, and is a big headache today for the United States, is the INF Treaty, and the fact that Russia is all the time playing at the brinks and at the margins of the INF Treaty. And there are a lot of statements from the side of the United States that Russia is breaching the treaty regularly. It happened since 2012, and before with the testing of the RS-26 Rubezh at the distance less than 1,500 kilometers, which is forbidden by the INF Treaty. But at that time, Russia explained that the whole range of RS-26 is 6,000 or 11,000 kilometers, and the problem was just that the two test sites, Kapustin Yar and Sharishagan, are just too close between the other. That is why the distance was not so long. Also, in 2017, Russia has deployed SSC-8, which is often described in the United States as the land-based version of the sea-launched cruise missiles Caliber. And we know that by the INF Treaty, it forbids the land-based missiles which range is lower than, which is between 500 and 5,500 kilometers. What is the strange thing here is Russia is regularly denying the breach of the INF, and at the same time Russia is severely criticizing the deployment of the European ballistic missile defense, saying that the interceptors Aegis and Ki-41 launchers are very much can be very easily adopted for launching the Tomahawk missiles, and therefore it will be the breach of the INF Treaty. So the question is why they are doing this. And because, you know, well, now we are going slowly to the United States nuclear policy, but we'll come back to the INF because it's one of the critical issues in the dialogue of Russia and the United States. So here I'm on a very slippery slope because we know that the nuclear posture review is still upcoming, and but there are a lot of predictions as for the way how it will look like. So there are a lot of predictions. Probably not all of them will be fulfilled, the one which you see on the slide. But I believe that one of the main goals of the United States by drafting this nuclear posture review was to respond Russia's escalation for the escalation strategy. And there were a lot of statements from the US officials that we should do something to accommodate our nuclear posture review for the Russian challenge. So probably the widely discussed idea is to introduce the low-yield nuclear weapons for the sea-launched ballistic missiles, which will be a very significant step, even in comparison with the policy of Bush administration, who were discussed this issue for a long time, and then Congress banned this because the introduction of the low-yield nuclear warheads will lead to the lowering of the nuclear threshold and the higher possibility to start any kind of nuclear exchange. Also, the idea is that sea-launched cruise missiles Tomahawk will come back. I mean, they are still there, but they are only have only conventional versions. And now the idea to bring back the nuclear-tipped Tomahawks is very popular, and I think that it can have it will be realized. Also, the relaxation of constraints on using nuclear weapons, because Russia's possibility to use nuclear weapons regionally, it threatens Baltic states all the time, and the display of the coercive strategy irritates the United States very much. So there is an idea that the nuclear threshold in using nuclear weapons in the U.S. Policy will be lowered. Well, as for nuclear testing, I don't know, and but anyway, the nuclear posture review will be adopted for the new challenges, not only Russian but North Korean, of course, and of course it probably will concentrate on the increasing of the credibility of the U.S. response to the current challenges. And also, I thought that it was very inspiring to cite the Vice President Pence, who said there is no greater force for peace in the world than the United States nuclear arsenal. It sounds, in the spirit of the Cold War very much, and in the spirit even of the Soviet quotes during the Cold War. So it looks like everything goes to the more severe confrontation in the field of nuclear policy. So coming to the specific issues, something which is on the agenda of the United States now, it's how to respond to Russia's breaching of the INF. So there is two possibilities. First of all, of course, it's a carrot and stick strategy, but I will start from the stick strategy. There is the INF Preservation Act, which is introduced by the Congress, and now it's negotiated with the Senate. And it's supposed that for the breach of the INF, the United States should respond by creation of the land-based cruise missiles from any types of models which are going on and produced now in the United States, starting from the Tomahawks to make the ground version and coming up to the later versions of the other different stuff. So why is it so popular? The idea is to present a so-called unacceptable alternative to Russia's violations. So Russia will be looking at this possibility. Russia will be possibly constrained and will possibly forced to come back to INF and to stick to INF. But, well, it's very doubtful perspective, because we know that in the face of some kind of threats, of serious threats, Russia used to behave in an opposite way. It used to behave. No one can predict how it will behave, but it's possible to predict that Russia will just abandon the INF, saying that it was the United States who has broken the treaty, and therefore Russia will stop, developing and deploying their missiles with no limits, and the United States will be the guilty side. So it will just spoil their reputation. So therefore, I don't think that the increasing of the so-called Cold War spirit between the two sides will serve to the interest of the United States. There is a carrot strategy for the United States here. So it's still possible to negotiate, because Russia never accepted that they have breached the INF treaty, and they also have certain charges in the address of the United States. So there is an idea that Russia just wants to have a good bargaining leverage to discuss with the United States the possibility to do something to change maybe in the INF or connected with the European ballistic missile defense. So why not to create a sort of special verification commission which will go both to explore these Mk-41 launchers in the US missile defense and also explore the SSC-8 to explain and to understand that they are not damaging the INF treaty. If that won't be enough, to start, it's never damaging to start a dialogue. But if it won't be enough, the United States can also always respond to Russia in a more severe and hard way by not breaching the INF treaty, but just deploying of the nuclear tipped version of the Tomahawk missiles and by some conventional responses without breaching the INF and still preserving its reputation, which I think is it makes sense, especially for the current administration. So coming back to conclusions, I would like to say that today the number of challenges between the Russian-US relations, they're increasing, and there is a high chance to believe that the Trump administration will step away from the Obama's nuclear policy. Probably, yes, the situation, the oil climate with Russia's relations will be aggravated, and there is a very high risk of going to the new Cold War, involving Europe and deploying. So if the INF will be breached, of course it's not a strategic probably damage, but it will involve Europe as it was in 1980s, as the Second World War, Cold War time, and I think that it won't serve to the interests of Russia or the United States. Well, at the same time, when there is a North Korea on agenda and Iran on agenda, so I believe that it's better to start dialogue before you can use the last and the worst option. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Polina. Our final panelist today will be Nikolai Petrov from the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, and he's going to speak on Russian 2017 foreign policy through the lens of domestic politics.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I'd like to congratulate you with the centenary from Great October Socialist Revolution. It happened yesterday. It's a very important issue, and I'm here among my esteemed colleagues just to justify the title of our session. It's about interrelationship between domestic and foreign policy, so I should add a little bit of domestic politics. And in Russia, unlike in some other states, it's very complicated, especially now, to separate between foreign policy and domestic politics, and there are several reasons. One of them is that persons who are making decisions in foreign policy and domestic politics are pretty much the same, like Vladimir Putin, like Vladislav Surkov, like Igor Sechin, like Nikolai Patrushev. Second, logics is pretty much the same, and the explanation of several huge mistakes made by Russia, by the Kremlin, with regard to foreign policy, especially with regard to Ukraine, is that Ukraine all the time was treated just like in the same way as Russia. And here I'm coming to the idea that Putin is not very well informed, and that's why he makes decisions based on wrong assumptions. In my view, he's informed pretty well, and if to imagine the person who is staying in power for 18 years and is still capable to get a lot of information, if not very well balanced, then at least very sophisticated information. There is another problem. It's connected not with the information, it's connected with the metrics. So we do organize information we are getting according to metrics which is in our heads. And all of us are professional idiots in the sense that, well, some are, legal idiots, some are geographic idiots, so we do, some are economic fatalists. So this means that, well, the only way we can deal with the information we are getting is the one which is connected with our professional idiocy. So Putin is, ordinary man. It sounds strange, but nevertheless. And that's why he cannot understand how the leader of such a great country as the United States cannot be almighty guy, but can be somehow limited by the parliament. So he differs between the way how you should explain certain problems and the way how it works in real life. So his idea is, I think, very understandable, and I suspect that all other leaders, including American leaders, do have the same restrictions because their matrix is very different from Putin's matrix. So, and goals. Goals in foreign and domestic politics in Russia are pretty much the same, and I'll not speculate about this now. Perhaps there will be questions. My second point is that US-Russian relations are the key to understand what was going on in Russia this year and what will happen next. And at the beginning of the year, there, well, it looked very different from what we see now, and there were two basic options for future. One, it was connected with well, initiating some liberal reforms, at least in economic sphere, and that's why Putin got this order. That's why his strategy should be finished by May, and so on. Now it looks like this option is totally forbidden, at least for a while. So it will never happen, at least till the presidential elections, and it's understandable, and this is the basics of Putin's strategy, that without improving relations with the West, economic reforms are absolutely impossible. The problem is that there is another option which is developing now, and it's connected with this besieged fortress, and here Russia, which is suffering and will suffer even more so from Western sanctions, doesn't look as the country which is on the eve of any kind of very essential changes, revolution, and so on. So we are suffering, but our reserves are much bigger than in many other countries of the world. And all the time when looking at Russia, we should have in mind that Russia is not, well, surrounded by paradise, by those countries which are developing pretty well, which are very rational and which do not face any problems. So the problem is who will, well, become critically weaker first. Russia, Ukraine, the West, Europe, the United States, and it's not that easy to answer this question. My second point is, my third point, to be exact, is connected with the leverage, which is much weaker with regard to Russia in case of the West, due to sanctions and counter-sanctions, due to all these moves which took place last years with Western organizations, with Western sponsors, well, pushing out from the country, and well, it makes very serious difference as well. So I would say that 2014 not only brought huge losses, but there were some gains, at least from the point of view of the Kremlin. First of all, there was, well, elites are now united by blood, like in the criminal world. And those who were not eager to stay within this team are out, including Vladimir Yakunin, including Margelov, and some other guys who were not eager to, well, to make these promises and to consolidate around the leader. And the second gain is finishing construction of neo-nomenclaturian system with the assistance of the West. Not only there is fence constructed by the Kremlin, which does not let elite to go out or even to think about the possibility to betray, but there is another fence constructed by the West which serves the same goal. So control of the Kremlin over elites is much bigger than it used to be before 2014. My fourth point is connected with legitimacy trap. When Putin switched to the new kind of legitimacy in 2014, offering Crimea as the huge achievement, and he was applauded by majority of his fellow countrymen, it brought him much stronger legitimacy, and the only problem is that it's not that easy to keep this legitimacy. Elections does not help to keep this legitimacy, and the leader who is elected by Putin's margin, like in 2012, is a weak father of the nation. So he's one of several leaders, strongest one, but it doesn't help. So that's why the problem is how to go out. There is nothing else like Crimea which can be presented. The West does increase sanctions, and there is another threat, and the Kremlin doesn't want to face the threat of increasing sanctions. So what they can do, and this is another direct consequence of foreign political decisions onto domestic politics, is to use repressions. And here I'm coming to my favorite point about the scale of political repressions in present-day Russia. It's really very serious. We did calculate how many governors, deputy governors, and mayors of regional centers are put into the jail each year, and it appeared that it's 2% of all these guys. So we do have 800 to 900 guys of this level, top level regional political elites. 2% are put into the prison each year, and not only the scale of repressions at both federal and regional level increases all the time, but they are pretty tough. So it's like, say, recently the trial has been ended on the so-called Sugrobov's case. It's the competition between FSB and the Ministry of Interior, and the guy who was the head of this main department of the Ministry of Interior got 22 years in prison, and he was accused of doing what he was obliged to do in order to get a promotion, in order to get salary, and so on. So he was put into the jail for 22 years. So my sixth point is about public opinion, and this is very important. Although Russian foreign policy is the set of real disasters and huge mistakes, it's considered to be the most positive and the most successful among all different kinds of policies evaluated by the population. And this is a very serious problem, and I put several recent tables as appendix to my memo, and it's very important to understand, first of all, that Russian foreign policy has huge domestic support, not only by all political forces, almost all political forces in the country, but by a huge majority of Russians. And look at list of the most important problems considered by ordinary Russians. They do name 24 most important problems, and only 3 of them are connected to foreign policy. It's the war in eastern Ukraine, which comes number 10. Only 14% of Russians do think that this is one of the most serious problems. Then there is threat of explosions and other terrorist attacks, number 12. And then there are Western sanctions against Russia, which are considered to be serious by 11% of Russians. It's number 15. And it's needed to understand that by Western sanctions, majority of Russians mean counter-sanctions, which were imposed by the Kremlin. The next interesting thing coming out of these tables, well, there are many very interesting things, like say, what should be major priorities for Russian foreign policy, and almost the same share of Russians do think, and this is number one, that provision of peaceful and secure existence of the country is the biggest priority, 59%. It's the same starting from 2007. The second, and it's going down, is restoration of Russia's credibility as one of the most influential countries. Containment of the West's expansion and of American influence growth is considered to be as a major priority number 7 by 19% of Russians. There are some more very interesting things about major enemies of Russia, and the United States did win in competition with Georgia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia in 2013, by the way, before the annexation of Crimea, and it's almost stable. The country number 2 is now Ukraine, and we can discuss it a little later. My last point is connected with the fact that, unfortunately, developments in both domestic and foreign policy can be described as, downward spiral. And they are connected to each other. And that's why I do think that there are no reasons to wait for any improvements in both spheres. They do influence very essentially each other. And it's going down. It's going down for sure till March 18th, when presidential elections will take place, and there are a few reasons to hope that something will improve after the presidential elections. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we have 10 minutes for questions, maybe a couple more, but we can't push too far in because we have lunch and we start up at 1:30. So let me open it up to questions and comments from the audience. Yes, in the back. Hey, Regina. I couldn't see you.
Hi, I'm Regina Smith, Indiana University. I have a couple of questions. Kim, one of the things that I hear a lot is that the presidential administration has its own sort of information producing, decision making role in what's going on, and that there's almost like a sort of think tank attached to it. And I wondered if that plays into the information processing that we're giving. And then, Nikolai, one of the things we're hearing a lot about the presidential election is that people will vote for Putin because he's great on foreign policy. And I wonder how that narrative that's coming out in some public opinion polls fits with priorities. Are people saying foreign policy doesn't matter because it's all squared away, Putin's got it? Or are they really disinterested?
Do you want us to answer? On the presidential administration question, that's a really good question, but it doesn't get at the logic of what's happening, because then the question just becomes, are people in the presidential administration unfamiliar with the way that U.S. politics works, or are people in the presidential administration people who have differing interests and are therefore trying to influence the agenda in various directions? And I mean, I thought what Nikolai said was very interesting, but at the same time, if the matrix in Putin's head is not serving economic interests in Russia as well as it could be, that still raises the question of why isn't anybody trying to change or influence that matrix. And so I think I mean, you're right. I should look into what the presidential administration is saying. I don't know if we have information about the kinds of arguments they're making, but that would be a good thing to look into.
Yeah, first of all, let me say that there was a very interesting international team which was focused on decision making in Russia, and we did, well, under the leadership of didnt, so we did finish the book, which should be published by the end of this year by Brookings. Unfortunately, and that's why I do not offer you to buy this book, it appeared impossible to describe how decisions are made. Instead of this, our team did describe major, most influential actors. And in terms of foreign policy, it's not from this book, by the way. In terms of foreign policy, there are a few guys whom Putin does listen, and Kudrin is not one of them. So Kudrin comes with the idea that, well, there should be very essential foreign political changes in order to make it possible to realize his program, but he's listened with regard to his program and his economic strategy, but not in foreign policy. And it's not that easy. I did mention some of these guys, but it's not that easy to realize who exactly is doing what. So in terms of Putin's popularity, well, you know, I did spend some time in Minnesota at a time when its governor was Ventura, and there was T-shirt, my governor will certainly beat your governor. And it was a matter of crowd there. And it's almost the same in foreign policy. And I would say that I didn't touch this problem, but what is going on here in this country with your president, contributes a lot into Putin's popularity as of more reliable, more rational, and more successful leader. Sorry.
Can I ask a follow-up? So, Nikolai, how do you know who the few guys are, and how do you know that Putin listens to them?
Well, here we're coming to the Kremlinology. So I do have a lot of connections, and I'm trying to, well, you know, when dealing with Russia in terms of decision making, you should work as Cuvier, for example. So you can have one small bone, and you should reconstruct the whole beast using this small bone.
So what's your small bone?
Well, it's inside the information, so I cannot. Well, I'm trying to make it clear and understandable, but I think that they themselves, in many ways, cannot describe how this or that decision have been made. And you perhaps did read Treisman's article on how decision on Crimea has been made. It's different from what has been published by New York Times, and I do not buy this description in New York Times about, well, these 5 persons who came together to make this decision. But, well, I think that Russia is, it looks like a black box, but it's a little bit transparent if only you do know some secrets.
Other questions and comments from the audience? Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I'm Chaim Braun, from affiliate from CISAC and Stanford University. The question for Arkady Moshes. Regarding Russia relations in Eurasia, you did mention the SCO. How's Russian participation in SCO in this area? And in addition, what is Russia's position regarding the Chinese One Belt and One Road system?
In the texts that I chose for this work, there isn't actually much on the SCO. And I think because it was discussed earlier, the general attitude is positive, but there are no particular expectations. Because already probably a decade ago, people in Moscow realized that SCO has all the chances to become China's pet project rather than Russia's pet project. And therefore, the attitude has to be positive, careful. The organization was developing and progressing a bit, but it's not going to be the backbone of anything. I think, again, it's my reading of other people's perceptions, which they do not even phrase that much in the text that I analyzed. As far as the Belt and Road Initiative is concerned, that the official attitude and also the attitude of these experts is very positive. And I think the attitude actually changed a couple of years ago already. I mean, originally there was some caution that it would become an instrument of China's instrument of weakening Russia's positions in the region. But what I recall, there was a text, I remember one of the authors was Alexander Lukin, and that was written already some time ago. Again, it was not the part of this sample of text, where he basically argued quite clearly that Russia cannot resist it. You cannot stop it. If you want to enjoy at least some of the benefits, you need to join it. And the official discourse now speaks very much about harmonization. And it's accepted by Beijing. It's a kind of this type of the language that you have to harmonize specific projects. But as I mentioned, it looks like there is a difficulty of what specifically Russia can offer, what kind of specifically it can request. And if we look at the transportation component of the actual policy, it seems that Russia is not going to gain much, because, well, the whole Belt and Road Initiative is very vague. I mean, the Chinese can put everything they want under the auspices of the Belt and Road. But what we see is that the specific logistical and transportation projects actually go anywhere, but not through Russia. So Russia is not going to be a beneficiary, number one, if and once it's got to materialize.
Okay, all right, we've got time, one more.
Sergey Golunov, Brochure University. My question is to Vladimir Popov. One of your arguments is that Russian-American trade turnover is dropping, but to what extent it can be attributed just to foreign oil prices, because Russian trade turnover with most of countries is dropping.
Yeah, should I just respond to it? Yeah, this is true, but under normal conditions, yes, I'm not prepared to say to what extent, although it is easy to make these calculations. Yes, I can make this calculation and come up with the answer, say, tomorrow, right? But my general impression is that under normal circumstances, trade is supposed to increase by about 10%. Even if oil prices are dropping, then trade probably should increase, by 2% or 3%. It's just the feeling. I should check it, of course. Yes, I'm not prepared to respond right away. But the feeling is that it is supposed to increase a little bit, or at least be stable. It is not supposed to grow, because under normal circumstances, as I said, trade between two countries grows because of two reasons. One, the normal growing inflation, because these are the numbers in current prices, not in constant prices. And second, because normally trade expands, and it expands faster than GDP growth. So GDP growth is 2 to 3%, then trade should expand by 5%, plus another 2-3% inflation. So it is not normal that this trade is dropping. If I can use the time to comment on two issues that were raised in the panel. One, there are two myths, I would say, which are very popular, but there is an alternative point of view, and I'd like just to put it on the table. One myth, Kimberly said, just in passing, that Russian presidential administration is not using the opportunities to promote economic growth of Russia because of sanctions, right? It's sanctions, they really inhibit Russian economic growth. This is not the case. The whole perception that you need free movement of goods and free movement of capital in order to have a strong economic growth is wrong. And it was proven times and again. China, when it was growing under Mao Zedong at 5% rate, or Russia, when it was growing in 1950s, had basically the closed economy. China, when it was growing under Deng Xiaoping in the first 10 years of the new course, 79 to 89, had tariff rates of 40%, on average, 40%. It was very controlled foreign trade. If you look at foreign direct investment, Japan and Korea did it without foreign direct investment. Yes, they were buying patents. This was a technology transfer, but no foreign direct investment whatsoever. China did not import foreign capital until 1990. In 1990, total accumulated stock of foreign direct investment was $2 to $3 billion only, so not that much. After that, yes, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong made it with foreign direct investment. So there are two routes. You can say that there is this route and the other route, but there are a lot of examples when you don't need it. But speaking about Russia, there are a lot of mistakes of economic policy, but something that Russia was supposed to do a long time ago is to impose some kind of barriers for trade in agriculture. And it was done only as counter-sanctions. Actually, this policy benefited agriculture, and it was supposed to be done in 1990s, when, in the beginning of 1990s, when liberalization of foreign trade occurred. There was supposed to be reasonable protection. Then you can take this protection away, but just to allow foreign trade in agriculture without any protection, at that time it was just to ensure that agriculture is going to go down with very bleak prospects for recovery, and this is what happened. And the second perception, so I think Nikolai said here that there are 5 people, you said you don't agree with this New York Times version, 5 people taking a decision. I don't know who was taking the decision, but you know, this is not a, what is the expression, this is not a brain, this is not the, there is an expression, this is not rocket science, as they say. If 90% of the people, you know that if you move the troops to Crimea, your popularity would increase, because 90% would approve it. If you don't move, your popularity would decline, you will be proclaimed as someone who betrays Russian national interest. So what do? Politicians do what is, you know, what is good for them in terms of public opinion. So, you know, it was not a brain drainer. Whoever advised probably said exactly that, and this was right from the point of view of gaining political capital. Thank you.
Yeah, just 2 quick answers to Vladimir. I'm not an economist, but what I have heard from people who are the experts is that the sanctions have had 2 very long-term deleterious effects on the Russian economy. The first is the banks aren't going back. And so foreign direct investment is not just the immediate stuff that's been happening now, it's that Russia's going to be on its own going forward as far as the West goes, because everybody's afraid to take the first step back because of the prosecutions that happened over the Iran sanctions and so forth. And the second thing is that my understanding is that people who are in the oil industry agree that Russia has lost out on a generation of innovation in especially the technology that's needed for exploring and developing what's called tight oil, the stuff in the Arctic and in other areas that are difficult environmentally to do. And again, Russia's not getting that back because it was so reliant on something that was moving very quickly in the rest of the world that it lost out on. And so I would disagree with Vladimir that Russia can be an autarkic economy and make it in the current global system.
This is about Crimea. According to the New York Times version, there were 5 men, including Putin himself, including Nikolai Patrushev, Sergei Ivanov, Alexander Bortnikov.
Putin said this.
Pardon?
Putin said this.
Yeah. The only problem is that all these guys who are responsible for realizing these final decisions took part in decision making at the very last moment when it should be decided who should do what. But in my view, there were at least 3 different decisions. One about confrontation with the West, and this decision, general confrontation with the West, which could take place without Ukraine, without Crimea, and decision was made in 2012. And preparation did start as early, at least, as in 2012. Then the next decision about the possibility to annex Crimea and what should be done in order to prepare this version and so on has been made. And only last decision was made just on the eve of the annexation, and it was the one where so-called loyal servants representing secret services and Ministry of Defense did participate, but it was not them who did make this decision. They were just getting concrete orders how to realize this general decision.
Okay. Well, on that note, please join me in thanking